Welcome to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. I'm your host, Rafe Kelley. At Evolve, Move, Play, our aim is to help you cultivate a more meaningful life and a more heroic self by reconnecting deeply to movement, mindfulness, nature, and community practices. This podcast was created to bring the best and brightest minds in all of these subjects together to better understand how we can create an empowering and sustainable ecology of practices for personal growth. If you're interested in being part of this ongoing conversation, the best way you can support us and get involved is by joining our Podcast Plus membership. By joining, you will get backstage access to our live podcast airing once a month, as well as a private question and answer session with me and our guests after the show. On top of that, you'll get access to our thriving online community where you can continue these deeper discussions with people all over the world who are just as passionate and curious about these topics as you. More details about the membership, as well as the link to get signed up, are in the description below. And whether you can join, be sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you can be notified every Monday when our episodes drop. Thanks so much for your support, and we hope you enjoy the show. Hey guys, welcome back to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. This week, my guest is Rob Gray. Rob Gray is the author of a new and really amazing book called How We Learn to Move. He's also an associate professor in applied psychology at the University of Arizona State. He's one of the leading figures, in my opinion, in understanding ecological dynamics in relationship to motor control. That's dynamical systems combined with ecological psychology. And he's been running a podcast of his own called the Perception Action Podcast, which has been one of my best guides in really deeply understanding motor and learning theory out there. I cannot recommend his podcast enough, and I think it's been immensely useful to me. I think if you're going to dive into his podcast, though, listening to this podcast first is going to be really helpful because we go through a lot of the language, which can be quite difficult as you're getting into this area, and break it down and give you practical examples of it. So if you have run into ideas like the constraints-led approach or differential learning, affordances, motor degeneracy, this kind of things, and you really want to have a deep understanding of it, Rob and I really dig into it and give you practical examples and ways to think about it. So it's an amazing exploration of those things. We also get into where potential missing pieces in something like the ecological dynamics approach are, and how we could think about it in other ways, or how we could grow that. So I think this is a fascinating conversation. I really was so excited to be able to speak to Rob. He's honestly one of my biggest intellectual influences. I know he may not be as well known to those of you in the audience, but to me, this was an absolutely incredible opportunity to dive deeply into some of the most important ideas, I think, in understanding how we can perform better as coaches and as athletes. So if you're interested in that at all, please stick around and watch this conversation with Rob. I even think the ideas around ecological psychology are actually critical to understanding the aspects of the meaning crisis that we talk about on this channel. So there's so much depth and richness in this conversation. It's really one of my favorites, so don't miss it. Enjoy my conversation with Rob Gray. Rob, welcome to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. It's a pleasure to speak with you again.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
So you have a new book out called How We Learn to Move, which I just finished last night. It's wonderful. I highly recommend it to anybody who's interested in training, right? If you're trying to get better as an athlete, trying to help athletes get better, I think it's a really amazing resource. And your podcast, the Perception Action Podcast, has been a huge influence on me. It's been really one of the best places that I've sourced insight that's helped me shape my training. So thank you. And in your book, you describe what you call a revolution in movement training. Mm-hmm. So I just want to start with getting some of these concepts more defined for people. For people who are in my audience, a lot of them will have heard me talk about some of these things, but I think you're going to be able to give a little bit more clarity. So let's start with, what is the revolution that's currently happening in movement training that you describe?
Yeah. So I deliberately chose that word to kind of be provocative, sell books, but also I do think there's kind of a fundamental change along two lines that I really try to emphasize in the book is the moving away from the idea of repetition, right? That the way that we become skillful is learning to repeat the one correct technique over and over, which is still surprisingly, even though, once you get in kind of people that are aligned with this view, you think it's kind of lost, but a lot of people still subscribe to that. And also the revolution that away from the idea of automaticity, the idea that becoming skillful is like almost like disconnecting from the environment. So you want to become reflexive by these programs that run on their own. You don't have to think about kind of getting rid of that idea and trying to go to more that really skillful is about being connected to your environment, establishing relationships with it. So those are the two things. There's a lot of roots to this, and it's in a lot of different themes and areas. But that's kind of what I mean by revolution in the title.
So just to repeat back what you said, you're saying that essentially there's a revolution in understanding of what being skillful means, where it's not simply being able to repeat a movement pattern or to make a movement pattern automatic. So the last time we spoke, is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. And one way to think about it, even the term we use, skill acquisition, the idea, kind of a very asymmetrical view that skill is in you, all in your head and knowledge, versus a more symmetrical view that skill is your relationship with the environment. Yeah.
So the last time we spoke, I was on your podcast. It was a wonderful conversation with Sean Mishka, Josh Peacock, and Scott Seabright about applying the constraints-led approach within or ecological dynamics in the martial arts context. So I had Josh and Scott on my podcast as well. And so my podcast with Josh just came out this week. And in the comments, people are like, but first you have to teach the fundamentals, right? Right? Like if you don't do kata, he comes from a traditional martial arts background, specifically Taekwondo, Korean martial arts, and Taekwondo, like karate, has these traditional katas. And so the question that was happening in the live chat was, how are we going to teach people the fundamentals without kata, right? Like, don't you have to teach the fundamentals before people can play the game? So if skill is not just, and the idea you'll always hear in this context is that I want to make these certain patterns of blocking and striking automatic so that when somebody attacks me, I'll have access to these skills and I'll be able to do them automatically. Can you explain why that really isn't a good description of how skill actually is expressed in vivo, right? In context.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rafe. And that's in all sports, right? A lot of sports too. You need to swing before you can play golf and dribble before you can play soccer, right? The fundamental idea I think we're trying to get across is that those are not really skills, those decomposed movements. Skills are functional, information driven, right? I put my arm up to block you when you punch, right? It has a specific purpose. It has to be driven. The timing of it, the position of my arm is driven by what you're doing in front of me. The information I get from your body, that's where the skill is, right? Not in just be able to produce the movement out of context. The term we use, decoupled, right? Because a coach tells you to lift your arm. That's aesthetics to me. That's not skill, right? That's and in some sports, aesthetics is part of the skill itself when you're being judged. But that's a big difference for me. The idea that you can learn movements without them being driven by the information and then put them back into a situation. In soccer, you don't just pass. You need to learn when to pass and why to pass, and use the information to drive the decision. I guess that's another part of it too, right? The skill is decision making, right? And you're taking away all the decision making from an athlete when you're just getting them to do these movements out of context.
So if I have two athletes and I say to one of those athletes, right, you're going to throw a rear hand punch, okay, and then you're going to block with a cross block, say, and we just have them repeat that skill. What is being missed that's actually necessary for them to be able to skillfully use that in a situation where they're having a live sparring match?
I think, the information that drives why you want, like, even if it's you're the one initiating, there's a reason you do a certain punch because you detect opening right? And so the information that's driving that movement, that's giving it a purpose and a function, is not there, right? You're just doing it because the coach, you're telling them to do it.
Yeah.
And we know it sounds like, oh, okay, well, what's the big deal? You could just plug it in. But we know that you move differently when it's not purposeful like that. And putting it back in is not as trivial as it sounds, right? Knowing when to do it and why to do it is not. And, that's kind of the idea. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this comes down to the idea of representativeness, right? We're trying to make the practice as representative of the context in which it would be applied as possible. So we see this in the martial arts. I think the martial arts are a particularly beautiful place to kind of see how these dynamics can get out of control, because we have the example of the live martial arts versus martial arts that don't practice live at all. Mm-hmm. And what we see is that if you look at how say an aikidoka strikes when they're trying to. So you have the uke, the person who's receiving the technique, right? So the uke will strike, they'll throw a punch in order for the other athlete to throw them. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the way that Aikido punches are thrown, they're completely non-representative of how punches are thrown mm-hmm. in the street, right? Someone will throw from a distance that is completely, they don't actually have an affordance to land that strike when they initiate the strike.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then also the way that they strike is completely telegraphed. The strike, in fact, exists to afford the capacity for it to be thrown. It doesn't mm-hmm. exist to allow that athlete to hit the other athlete.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I know exactly what you just brought to mind. I've been using this because I've been playing a lot of pickleball lately. Okay. And I'm playing with my young stepson, and the way that I play, like trying to get him into it, learn it. So I hit shots deliberately so they bounce waist high right to him. Like I'm trying to afford him the action. I'm not trying to win points myself, right? Because I'm trying to get rallies going. So that's kind of the same thing I think you're talking about. The function of the punch, an original punch, is to afford the reaction, which is totally different than a coach or real match. Yeah. Yeah.
And there's some value to that because, as you said, like in order for your sorry, was it your son or your nephew?
Stepson. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
You have to give him enough experience to sort of get off the ground. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You can't try to win too early in this interaction mm-hmm. or the information is overwhelming for him. But if you were to play like that, if you were to give him that type of interaction forever, he would never become a skillful pickleball player.
Yeah. And, to me, that's the kind of fundamental difference of, we call decomposing versus scaling, right? Yeah. So he still has to pick up the flight of the ball. He's swinging to get the ball back over the net. So the skills all still there. I just really made it easier, right? He doesn't have to move laterally as much and move backwards as much to adjust for different bounce heights and things like that. So I think that's So I think that's the fundamental. So repetitiveness is not meaning that everything has to be exactly the same as the competition, but there's certain key features. And one big one is the information driven, right? The information, you want the similar information that drives the movement to be there.
Yeah. Let's come back to that when we get more deep into the constraints-led approach. I want to ground again some conceptual stuff here. So one of the big influences in your approach and everyone who's kind of thinking about skill this way is Nikolai Bernstein. Mm-hmm. And he described two problems of motor control that are really important to understand. One is context conditioned variability. And you have a beautiful quote from Rafa Nadal about that. So you can tell us a little bit about what specifically is context conditioned variability and why is it such a problem for a kind of repetition focused approach or top down schema controlled approach to motor problem solving.
Yeah, so that's Bernstein kind of came out. So when he started working, the essential idea of the motor program was there, right? That the idea that you pull, in that case, it was more of like a piano player. You pull the sheet of music that forced a forehand stroke off this shelf, and you send a command down. Your brain does, and it sends a command. This muscle does that. This muscle does this, and you swing. The
little man in the head.
Bernstein came out and said, no, wait, that's never going to work, because the actual output the muscles would generate completely depends on the context, what position your body's starting in, how fatigued they are, all these factors. So the same muscle outputs will never produce the exact same response, because there's variability in the conditions. And Nadal gives a great one where he talks about every tennis stroke being different because the ball spin trajectory, maybe he worked out before, he's tired, all these things. So the idea is that you can't, that I think in the book I said, the Bernstein changed the problem. The motor control problem before he got there was, how do we produce the same outcome in the same conditions with the same movement? Yeah. Bernstein came in, no, there's different in the middle, right? The problem is, how do you produce the same outcome under ever-changing conditions? This context. How do I know to change my muscle force a little bit, because the environment, internal and external environment, are changing? Yes.
So one of the points you make in the book that I thought was really interesting is this idea that human movement is inherently noisy, right? So that Nadal quote is like, every shot that you experience is actually different. So you're never going to get if you're playing tennis, you're never going to get a stroke from the other player and a shot coming in that's the same in every way as some previous shot. There's always going to be a different in velocity, a different in spin rate, a difference in angle that it's coming in at, a difference in where it came from on the other side of the court, or the body positions that the other athlete was in. So that's all external variation. So obviously the athlete needs to have some adaptability, or, from a schema, what we might call the adjustability, in order to execute whatever is the optimal movement solution there. But also, you point out that not only is there noise in the external environment, but as that athlete tries to execute their stroke in response, there's lots of noise actually in the way that their joints and muscles are working. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a really, this is something we kind of really hide in a lot of, And I'll give an example I like to give in one of my classes I teach. If you look at like fMRI research, where they show, the parts of the brain in color.
Functional magnetic imaging.
Yes. So they show you what parts of your brain lights up when you read a book. Yep. Right? It looks like, okay, it's this part doing it. How they generate those things is they take a scan of your brain when you're doing nothing. Mm-hmm. And what you find is your whole brain is active when you're just sitting there doing nothing. Then they have you read, and your whole brain is still active, but these other little parts are slightly more active, and they subtract the two images. So it makes it look like when you read, only this part of your brain is active. Mm-hmm. Whereas we have these, we call them resting potentials. Your cells are constantly firing. We have this kind of background noise always in our body. I give the example, your heart rate variability. Your heart rate is not meant to beat like a metronome. If it does, it's a very unhealthy thing. Yeah. It varies its timing. And so we have all this kind of noisiness within our body, just naturally, never mind if we're tired, we're at the end of a tennis match, or we worked, a heavy weightlifting session before. Those all change the external environment too. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that brings us to what Bernstein described as the degrees of freedom problem. Mm-hmm. So I want to introduce an idea that I've thought about for a while, which is that I think that we're inherently sort of analogical creatures. We think through in analogies, and that analogies unfortunately can become, they're very powerful for us, but they can also be traps in the way that they frame and we think about things. So if we look back to, say, Descartes and how he was sort of defining knowledge and how we should relate to reality, he almost starts to look at the world through the frame of what a clock operates like. Mm-hmm. Right? It's like a clockwork universe. And then as we go forward, you talked about in the 1920s when Bernstein was doing his work, the analogy was sort of like the automated piano playing sheet. Mm-hmm. And the current analogy that we hear all the time is that the mind is a computer. And so we think of a movement skill as like a software that we install, right? Mm-hmm. It's a motor program. So I'm going to go to Coach Rob Gray, and he's going to install the best version of the, hitting package, right? The baseball hitting package.
Yeah.
And then, my central controller is going to hit that pattern when someone throws a baseball that I can hit, right? Yeah. And if the mind is a computer, then the way that we think about the body is as a machine, right? Yeah. So now the computer program is sending the joints and muscles a program, and they operate it like a machine. But my understanding is that, essentially both of these analogies really fail when we dig deeper into them. The brain doesn't really operate like a computer, and the muscles really, really don't operate like machines. Like machines are generally built off of joints that have 1 degree of freedom. So can you explain a little bit about how a human body, the muscles themselves are inherently noisy, and why we have this problem of the degrees of freedom, and then what it offers us that a machine doesn't have?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think, the whether the brain computes or is a computer, people get what compute means. They can have a whole debate about that. But the biggest issue I find for me is that I don't like is the assumption that the body and action and movement is just subservient to thinking, right? Mm-hmm. The brain tells the body what to do, then it do. So our body is basically an Xbox controller, right? And then it just moves. There's no intelligence in your muscles, or like you think about what the representation of intelligence is. Rodin, the thing that someone's sitting there doing nothing, right? Whereas there's a lot of the idea of degrees of freedom is you have all these different ways to move, different solutions you can do. And the idea going forward, once you get into issues, I'm sure like self-organization, is there's a lot of intelligence at the lower levels of the system. It doesn't need to be told all what to do. So that's the big one for me. The idea is simply that the amount of software you would need, if you believe Nadal, you would have to have a program for that specifies the joints for every possible one of these combinations. It would be the biggest computer program ever. And I think I was thinking about this today. I think that now when I was coming into work, this is sort of mirrors what we thought about weather, right? Mm-hmm. When we started thinking about weather, we thought it was a complicated problem, right? Yeah. There's lots of variables. Barometric pressure, wind. All we need to do is know all of them and then put them all into a model, and we'd be able to predict weather perfectly. And I think that's one of the motivations for developing computers, actually, that if we could handle all these. Yeah. But it turns out weather's a complex problem, right? It's the variables interact in unpredictable little ways. And no matter how much we can process them or put them in math models, we can't predict weather perfectly way ahead of time because there's too many. And I think that's what we're seeing with the body. The computer analogy is treating it like it's complicated, right? If there's a lot of things I have to take into account, but if I could specify all the joint angles and muscles, I can figure things out. Whereas there's too much noise and degrees of freedom available that it doesn't really fit that model. Yeah. Sorry, I went off on a very tangent. Yeah. I just was thinking about that this morning, so I wanted to use it somewhere.
Well, we've talked about that a bit, and so I don't know if you're familiar with John Vervaeke, but he's one of my main, my main influences, and he talks a lot about the idea of complicated versus complex problems, and also ill-defined versus well-defined problems, which is another aspect of problem formation that's really interesting. But the complex versus complicated, a complicated problem, no matter how many details there are in it, essentially has a linear solution. So he describes this as algorithmic. An algorithm is when you know that you can derive a precise solution, right? Mm-hmm. But complex problems are what he would describe as combinatorially explosive. So
I love that. Yeah.
yeah. So chess is the example that he gives that I absolutely love, which is like chess is a relatively simple set of rules and moves available. But if you map out, so I think there's an average of 30 legal moves available per turn, plus an average of 64 turns per game, which means that the potential games that could play out in that space are 30 to the 64, which is comparable to the number of electrons in the universe. It's in the same approximate order of magnitude. So there's no way to derive an algorithmically correct way to execute a chess game or to look at any specific situation in chess and know precisely the right next move. Mm-hmm. So that's not a complicated problem. It's a complex problem. And for complex problems, we use heuristic control, right? We have biases towards what we pay attention to and how we operate something. Mm-hmm. So does that all code for you? That all makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I think I like that way of thinking about it, that's kind of non-deterministic, right? You can't, there's so many, and I like the explosive, like the small interactions just make things go off and completely unpredictable. I use
relatively simple beginnings.
Yeah. I use raising kids as my example of complex. Completely unpredictable. Yeah.
Yeah. You can't, you cannot specify your parenting input such that you can have a predictable thing, which is really interesting because, B.F. Skinner in behaviorism famously said, give me, a healthy, well-formed infant and I can give you a thief and a doctor and a lawyer and et cetera, right? The idea that we do have this deterministic ability to apply inputs and achieve deterministic outputs in human behavior. And in some sense, like, I think what you're saying is that not just at a psychological level, but at a motor control level, this is clearly not the case. Mm-hmm. We don't have that ability to determine the outcomes. There's always emergent aspects.
Yes. I think, the number of conditions and context and noise, all kind of makes the human body is a complex system. I think I don't know how you could see it as otherwise. Yeah. And I think another example in your deliberate practice in a way is tried to do the same thing. B.F. Skinner. I'm sure people would hate me saying that, but it's because the same kind of thing. We can get expertise through this combination of
everyone will get the same results. I mean, I've had so many people quote the 10,000 hour rule to me, and it just drives me nuts. I'm like, there's no amount of hours that I could play basketball that would ever result in me achieving the capacities that Michael Jordan has, or LeBron James has, or Steph Curry has. Right? That's not within my, grasp. Right? My talent set doesn't stretch to that, and I've seen research that shows that deliberate practice, something like 10% of the result when you look at elite athletes, like differences in how much they practice. Yeah. Like everybody who's in the NBA has practiced enough, right? Yeah. And some of them practice a lot, and some of them practice not that much. And we lionize stories like Kobe Bryant, right? Mm-hmm. And we think that Kobe Bryant's success was because of his work ethic. And we think, okay, well, would Allen Iverson have been greater than Kobe Bryant if he had practiced like Kobe Bryant?
Very different. Yeah.
Or was Allen's approach to him to practice actually maybe closer to optimal for his individual temperament and physicality, right? And given that he's 160 pounds, and hyper explosive and has to get smashed by these big athletes, maybe practicing 4 or 5 hours a day on top of the gameplay would have been much more destructive for him than someone like Kobe, who's much more physically robust to the demands of the sport.
For sure. Yeah, no, I think, that all fit these interactions and these, the constraints, are so different. And I think that's another big, and I know you're totally the individuality of learning that, kind of another thing in this revolution, the idea people don't learn in the same way. They don't move in the same way. I think is a big point out of it for sure.
So I want to go back because I still feel like I'd like you to give a little bit clearer definition of the degrees of freedom problem. Like, I think it's such a fundamental thing for people to understand. Like, why is that a problem for understanding motor control? Like, what is the degrees of problem? Why is it a problem for understanding motor control? And what does it actually give us in making us what we are, more adaptable than something like a machine?
Yeah. No, I think it's kind of this funny flipping on the head, right? So, okay, if we accept there's no one way to move and we have lots of different options we could do to something like serve a volleyball or something like that. Now we've created another problem. We've created the problem of choice, right? Yeah. There's so many options. Human beings aren't good at, how do I get a volleyball over the net? How much should I bend my elbow? Use my wrist? Should I use my shoulder? Should I bend my knee? So we've created degrees of freedom. I kind of equate with options, really. For each possible joint angle, muscle, you could specify it into typical particular things in the physical, but it's basically options. And so it creates this problem of how do we get some initial proficiency and how do we find the optimal solution in this massive sea of all these different options? So so it's basically the problem of coordination, right? Yeah. So that's what Bernstein, not only, he fundamentally changed the question of what it means to be skillful from learning the right technique and being able to repeat it to being the problem of coordination. How do I pick the set of all these possible options, and how do I change the option I'm using based on the situation? I think is the idea of the degrees of freedom problem.
Yeah. So one of the ways that I teach this idea when I'm working with students is I will we'll do a drill where we do a 3-ball juggling cascade with 2 partners. So we can, it's hard for beginners to just do a 3-ball juggling cascade, but if you have 4 hands, it's actually easy to start getting this. You can get all 3 balls moving and in the air pretty much consistently. So I just show people that we're going to do this, and I have them figure it out. And then I point out to them that they adopt certain, it depends on the pairing, but they adopt certain patterns, right? So one thing that, that is pretty common, for instance, is we'll always catch with the same hand and always throw with the other hand. So we'll catch, shuffle, throw, catch, shuffle, throw, catch, shuffle, throw, right? And then it's like, well, are you catching coming down on the ball or catching coming up on the ball? Right. So that's a degree of freedom. And then we can look at, like, are you throwing the ball relatively high and creating an arc, or are you shuffling it very quickly in between the hands? That's a degree of freedom. And so we introduce that, like, there's many ways that you could solve this problem, and there's many ways that you can introduce different elements to it that can make it more challenging and more interesting. You can change which hand throws, right? You can do all these things. And so all those are illustrations to me of degrees of freedom. And then what I point out to people is that when they initially do this, what they're looking for is a stable solution in that. But also what I think is interesting is that if we think about degeneracy, what's going to happen is that you find your stable solution, but you're going to make errors, right? Your timing is not going to be 100% consistent every time. And so the hand that's catching has to have variability in its timing. It has to be able to adjust. It has to be able to adapt to shifts in the other person, because that coordination pattern has noise in it. So we need that noise. We need that potential, that degeneracy, to allow us to adapt around that central coordination solution.
Yes.
Yeah. So
No, I think that's a great way to think about it. I think another example I heard recently is we need, like, asymmetry in our stride and our legs. Like, if we were perfectly repetitive, we wouldn't be adaptable. Like, the noise actually, the variation actually helps us to adapt to the conditions. Yeah, that's a really nice way to think of it.
Yeah. Darian Barr has talked about the idea that, like, everybody actually has a leg that they dominantly sort of power with and a leg that they dominantly buffer with. So when you're running, there's one leg that's going to be putting more force in per cycle, and then one leg that's going to be maintaining the balance in the cycle. So every time you put reduced force on the ground, there's a certain amount of noise. So you might be starting to deviate slightly from that optimal pathway. And so you can kind of, you differentiate by having a kind of labor division between different legs. Mm-hmm. You allow them to fulfill different functions and then become more adaptive to providing that aspect of the movement solution that you're looking for.
Yeah, no, I love it. That to me is some of the intelligence I'm talking about in the body, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't try to tell it what to do, that's sort of the idea of a motor synergy, right? They're working together on their own, on the fly, to adapt to this adjustment without, and it's happening, the same thing in the ball thing, that task. Like if you get a bad toss, you might throw the ball slightly higher to give them more time for you. People make these conversations. If you let the system, work together, let it go on its own, that will never happen if you tell it exactly what to do. Like if it was repeating, you have to repeat the same throw every time. You can adjust to this and have this intelligence in terms of the parts working together in that really nice way. So
if you imagine a couple of robots that are given this juggling task, right? Mm-hmm. And each of the robot's joints is basically a single degree of freedom, right? So people say that like the elbow is a hinge joint, but it's not just a hinge joint. It has this rotational capacity. Mm-hmm. But maybe, but when we design robots, it's really hard to give them. We haven't been able to give robots really the intelligence to control the degrees of freedom that a human being has. So it's going to have this one thing. So you'd have to have the tolerances for the timing and the structure of the throw incredibly tight to keep the system from breaking down, because there'd be no degeneracy, no ability to respond to changes, right? So a slight error in timing would just propagate through the system without any buffer. Mm-hmm. But a human being has, we have a much wider set of potential solutions, which means that it can be less stable to start with, but then we have that ability to stabilize using those options. Yes. And we have this ability, the ability to adjust and adapt to multiple, weird tennis stroke behind the back, under the leg, incredible things come out. You're right. But yeah, you're right. That there's this kind of, so the degrees of freedom and this kind of adaptability are a problem, and adaptability are almost the opposite ends of the spectrum, right? You have this wonderful choice, which is difficult at first. But then it gives you all this amazing ability to adapt. Yeah. So we've talked about Bernstein. The other huge sort of influence in the way that we understand this, I think, is important to understand kind of the next thing, which is J.J. Gibson. Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about what Gibson brought to our understanding of motor control, and how perception and motor control have to be deeply interwoven? So how does Gibson fill out the picture that Bernstein started to develop for us in movement control? Yeah. So one way I like to parallel them is, Bernstein identified that there's all this variability in degrees of freedom in movement as a problem that we need to solve. Gibson essentially did the same thing with information, right? He's for example, how do we know how far away it is? Because the size of it changes both on its real size, its image, where its position is, so there's things varying in the image if we focus just on vision all the time, and we have all these options. Whereas, so he identified, well, there's that's going on, but we can pick out these key, he called them invariants, the information sources from the field that can tell us what we really want to know and what we need to control our actions. So the thing that really, to me, is the foundation of the kind of ecological dynamics and ecological approach is direct perception, right? The idea that within their environment, if we just look for it, or, there's information that specifies what we need to act. There's information that tells us how long we have before a ball is going to get there. It's specifying, by that he means we can pick it up directly. We don't need to do any computation, interpretation, prediction. So we don't need that computer we talked about on the information side either, right? Yeah. If we just
can link our movement to these information sources, we can, achieve our goals. And so critically, the reason we call it, ecological psychology, that's his area that he founded, is that in order to, because it's information driven and it's specific to the situation, you have to consider the ecology of the mover, the performer, right? You can't understand movement unless you understand the environment it's happening in, because that's where the information comes from.
Yeah, I've heard it said that that Gibson asked not what's in your head, but what your head is inside of. That's the critical thing to understanding how perception operates.
Yeah. I think someone pointed out to me, technically was William Mace that had that quote, but he's one of Gibson's kind of contemporaries. But so just to be, so I don't get in trouble for that again.
But the ecological psychology is sort of based around that idea.
Exactly.
So to give an example, like your main sport that you study is baseball, right? So traditionally, the way that baseball is described is, okay, so you're an outfielder, you're center fielder standing in the middle of center field. The pitcher throws the ball arrives at the plate. The hitter hits the ball and it takes off of his bat. And the traditional way of describing how the center fielder responds is that they create a mental model based off of the speed and trajectory of the ball coming off the bat that tells them where that ball will arrive. And then they move to the spot where they arrive. Mm-hmm. So your claim is that this isn't a good way to actually describe how motor control operates. And you've actually done some research, I believe, that shows that athletes behave in a way that is not consistent with this and that is consistent with a model where they're picking up information continuously online as they're watching that ball. Can you give an example of that, please?
Yeah. So let's take a step back there. So the fundamental idea, that Gibson didn't like. So the reason that we need to do that prediction and calculation of the ball's trajectory is because our perception, the information is not good enough. It's impossible. There's something about just looking at the ball, we have to do some processing because it's something called indirect perception. So I've done some in hitting, but in the fielding example you give, a bunch of other people have done, showing that you really don't need to do all this complicated prediction and calculation. If you just start running and run so that you keep, there's a few different variables people have identified, but one is the acceleration of the image of the ball on your eye. If you just run to keep that constant, right. An even easier example I'll give is like in American football. You're trying to tackle someone, they're running. If you run so as to keep the angle between you and the runner, what's called the bearing angle, constant, you will intercept the runner, guaranteed. You never have to predict where they're going to be and when. Yeah. If you run so that angle starts to get bigger, you speed up. It starts to get smaller, you slow down. So you just keep that angle, and that's kind of the Gibson's idea, information movement coupling. You're coupling your movement to this information source from the environment. You're not calculating anything. You will be guaranteed to intercept them. And we find birds use this. Sometimes this is used for navigation and sailing, the bearing angle strategy. So yeah, it's a very fundamental. And so in baseball, we see a bunch of evidence of that. Fielders don't ever just sprint to a location, stop and wait for the ball. They kind of catch it on the run. It explains why, if you've ever played baseball, balls hit right at you paradoxically are the hardest to catch, because if you look at the information, it's not very reliable at the start. It's hard to get set up that kind of coupling. But yeah, that's the basic idea, that we don't really need to bring in all this. So one of the Gibson's really ideas he wanted to do was, right, maybe that's the way it works, but it's not really necessary. That was it. He always wanted to do the simplest explanation. So we don't really need to do all that prediction stuff that we could never really understand because we can't get inside your head. What we can do is just couple our movement to the information if we find the right information source. Okay. Sorry, that was a long.
No, that's great. I wanted to go back for a second because so we're talking about the ecological aspect of vision and vision tracking and how that helps us interact with the environment. And obviously there's auditory and other cues, but there's also internal perception cues that are important to understand. Mm-hmm. So if you if your ankle turns over when you're running, right? The time that it takes your brain to process that and then send a correction down is generally going to be too long to correct it. Mm-hmm. So you have nerves and you have neural control loops that are happening at the joint and at the spinal level, if I understand correctly. Mm-hmm. So the way that we solve that degrees of freedom problem is partly by having a kind of distributed cognition or distributed neural control that isn't just in the head, but is actually at every level of the tissue.
Yes, exactly. The analogy I tried to, in the particular, so at the tissue and muscle level, they're working they have local rules they're following, mm-hmm. like local information. You're right. You're sensing the ankles bend too much. They have these local kind of intelligence laws they're working by that don't involve just following higher order instructions. The classic example is a flock of birds, right? The just staying away from your neighbor, this little simple rule that the system follows mm-hmm. and creates this incredible emergent overall behavior.
Yeah. Or we could look at, the type of commands that go through an anthill, right? Mm-hmm. A team of ants. They have a relatively simple set of commands that create this very complex behavior. And that's essentially how your neurology works. I was thinking about this when I was reading the book yesterday. There's this, we think that we tend to think that what we are is just the thing that sits inside our head, and the body is kind of, like a machine that the brain sits inside of. Mm-hmm. Right. But I was reading recently about some very strange things that have happened where people have gotten heart transplants and they've had cravings for specific foods that were the mm-hmm. heart. Right. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about the fact that if you took Michael Jordan's brain and you inserted it into Kobe Bryant, you wouldn't necessarily have a great basketball player. Because, especially if you took, let's say you just clone Michael Jordan himself, right? And you just leave his body in a vat and it develops until it's 25 years old, right? Mm-hmm. And so you have this perfect physical thing, right? You've been electrically stimulated. So the muscles are there. It looks exactly like Michael Jordan. Mm-hmm. You take Michael Jordan's brain and you insert it into that. And the idea would be, right, okay, so you've got all the skill, all the awareness of Michael Jordan, and now you have this body that has all the action capabilities that Michael Jordan had. Mm-hmm. But what I think is that actually you'd have very poor control at all the local levels. That it'd be, it'd be a retard. He'd be running around this retarded body.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's a view that, and part of what makes Michael Jordan great is he came up with solve the degrees of freedom problem for his own individual constraints and abilities. Yeah. And those would all change, right? I guess if I want to go back to my old analogy, it's kind of like you have a great video game player and you hand him an Xbox, could take away his Xbox controller and hand him a PlayStation controller, right? Yeah. Oh, the body doesn't matter. It's all in the player, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's kind of this kind of bias we've had for a long time that the body, you're right, is just the machinery that, expresses the brain's intelligence, right? It's not anything on its own, which so I think you're right.
So skillfulness is an attunement and an intelligence that's developed kind of at every layer up, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have the individual muscle cells are being attuned to the way in which they coordinate, right? And then the central motor neuron, and then the joint, and then the spine, and then the brain. The motor control isn't localized only in any one area. It's a relationship between all of them.
For sure. Yeah. And I think that's another one of Gibson's ideas, that it even changes the very perception. Like his idea of affordance is that idea that we don't perceive lengths, widths, speeds. We perceive passability of a gap, which depends on our body, right? So we perceive the world in terms of what our body can do. Yeah. It what the environment allows given our body's capacities. Sometimes the word he used, which we don't talk, is effectivities, is the opposite of affordance. So the environment affords stuff, our body that our body allows through these EF activities and capacities, right? So yeah, just moving a brain would be a whole different set of capacities that you would have to adapt to and adjust to, and right, you would not be optimal, right? That's why, you know, athletes can succeed with so many different body types and abilities, and right, because they've you know, playing within themselves. There's lots of phrases we kind of use to kind of express that. I think
they've solved the constraints. They're solved for the affordances created by their own structure. So can you just quickly, do you mind kind of digging into what a constraint is and what an affordance is, and then how those relate to effectivities or action capabilities? Sure.
Yeah. So a constraint is if we start with the degrees of freedom problem again, we have too many of these options, right? A constraint, the reason, you know, a lot of people, you start, why constraint? It sounds like how am I helping you with a constraint? Constraint sounds like a bad word.
Yeah.
But one of the things, a constraint is taking away a degree of freedom, right? It's helping you by taking away an option, right? And sometimes a coach can do this externally. Sometimes we do this ourselves. And then the classic example is Bernstein's freezing degrees of freedom, right? What he proposed, that one of the ways we might get initial proficiency is by taking some degrees of freedom away. I don't know what to do with my elbow. I won't use it. I'll lock my arm. There, I've simplified my movement problem a little bit, because I don't need to worry about that. So a constraint is something that takes away a degrees of freedom or changes the degrees of freedom, I guess is. So in your example of the catching, you're changing the task constraints by distributing it across two people. You're actually adding degrees of freedom in that way, but they're distributing them differently in an interesting way. Yeah.
So yeah, an example that I was thinking of, you used the example of a volleyball serve. I'm thinking of another example, which is, you know, we've all heard the phrase, like, you throw like a girl, which, you know, there's lots of girls who throw really well and lots of men who throw not well. So that's a little outdated, but there is this thing that someone who hasn't had a kind of lifetime of throwing is going to tend to throw only with their arm. So they're going to remove the degrees of freedom of how to organize the torso and how to organize the legs. And they're just going to throw like this, right? It's very awkward looking. It's very stiff, right? And it's not very effective.
Yeah.
But there's a lot less for them to try to control than if they're going to, you know, lean back, lift their leg up, stride forward, open their hips, time their shoulder, elbow, everything through that, right? So that's a good example of frozen degrees of movement, right?
Yeah, for sure. And other two ones I like to give are dancing and downhill skiing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right? Your upper body. So another way to freeze instead of locking something is just make everything do the same thing, right? So you sway back and forth with your upper body doing the same thing as your lower body, which looks very dorky and not very creative, but it gives you some proficiency to get going, right? That I think that's the big thing about it. And I always give the volleyball example. If I told you can't start playing volleyball, a game, until you can do a jump serve, you probably wouldn't. Not many people would be playing volleyball. Right? That's too complex. We got to get you on the court and get you motivated and all those other factors that matter. But yeah, throwing. You're right. Throwing is a great example. If you don't learn the basic coordination pattern from when you're younger by having to throw, you're going to have to solve the degrees of freedom problem later, and it's going to look ugly. Yeah.
So, to go back to constraints. So constraints basically set the potentials that are available within a agent arena relationship, right? So within parkour, I think it's funny. You'll often hear people say, screw gravity. I'm like, your whole sport would be meaningless without gravity.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Like it's not parkour anymore. Like
it would be
you imagine
easy if you could just float.
Yeah. Like actually, that's a good example. Like imagine moving into an obstacle course in a 0G environment.
Yeah.
Like a parkour athlete's skill set wouldn't necessarily have a high degree of transfer. Right? Some of the acrobatics of being able to twist and write and see yourself in the environment would be great. But like, there's all these expectations, all these couplings to how gravity is continuously pulling you down that would disappear. And that would, initially anybody moving into a zero G environment who hasn't been trained in it is going to be a total wreck motor control wise.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think, what I would say they're kind of expressing the idea there is that for most people, like gravity is a very severe constraint because of the way we tend to move. Is once you become a great parkour, you're actually making it less of a constraint because it's not gone. Obviously it's still a constraint, but now by the way that you move, because constraints interact. So gravity interacts with how you move. So you're actually pushing beyond the boundaries that the normal people that don't do parkour would have of gravity. Yeah.
As your action capabilities expand, the way that you perceive the constraints changes, which is the opening up of affordances.
Exactly. That was a perfect segue into the other term. Yeah. Affordance. So affordance, the opportunity for action. So whether it's staying longer in the air, getting through a gap in defenders, getting to a ball, the more action capacity you have, the more affordances you have in your opportunities for action. Whether you take them or not is a different story. The example I gave in the book, like Nadal, obviously compared to you and I, he could decide to run around a backhand and play a forehand if he really wanted. You and I probably don't have that affordance available to us. Yeah.
I was thinking about that example. And I was thinking about never mind. I'll drop that one. Okay. But so you're talking about one of the things you talk about that's really interesting is how your perception literally changes based on what your action capabilities are. So this ties into the idea that what we perceive isn't a accurate model of external reality from which we then derive how we can possibly move to it, but we actually see the world through how that information couples to our action capabilities. So you talk about the idea that, that when a baseball hitter is in a hot streak, the ball looks bigger to him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, kind of paralleling Gibson and Bernstein. This is Gibson's kind of he redefined what the problem of perception is. What is your perceptual system trying to do? The traditional view is it's trying to create this general purpose representation of what's out there that you can use for anything. So I'm going to measure distances, sizes, like creating an internal map of the world. When Gibson said, no, it's just trying to find the information it needs for your action you're trying to perform. So what you perceive is relative to what you're trying to do and what your body affords you and stuff. So you're not perceiving the qualities of the world, you're perceiving what it affords you. So when I'm playing really well, the ball affords hitting more than when it doesn't. So I see it as bigger.
You see it differently. Yeah. And that's, I experienced this. We talk about parkour vision, right? But it's a very interesting thing how you can, like, I'll be walking through an area and I'll look at something and think, okay, I think that's possible. But I have a very different perception of the environment when I'm warmed up and attuned to my sport than when I'm walking and just have other things going on. Yeah. And you have this sense of like almost a window opening, right? There's this very interesting thing where like all of a sudden the affordance to jump will appear. Yeah. Or it didn't appear before. Or you have enough of a cognitive model and a representation of how you move that you can sort of think, I think this version of me would be able to do that, but I don't feel it right now. But then you have to get into that state and it may not be afforded to you and you'd expect it. Or it can be the opposite. You can be like, I totally didn't think that was a thing. And then now that I'm here, all of a sudden it's just there for me. Yeah.
No, and then I think that's getting into calibration, right? Calibrating your abilities to the environment is a large part of this. And we lose calibration really easy. I would say, parkour is like a fantastic example of affordances because you're completely ignoring what things are designed for.
Yeah.
Right? You're not perceiving what they're designed for. You're perceiving what they afford, which is exactly what the example I use is cats. Like cats could care less whether that's a bookshelf, that's a bed, that's a bed, that's a, right? They don't care what things were designed for.
Yeah.
And that's what parkour is a lot about, right? It's a picking up opportunities for actions and things, not by how the environment is designed, but actually picking up information.
Yeah. Later, I want to ask you some questions about mental representations, because there's something interesting about the fact that obviously there's action capabilities, but there's also a mental approach that changes. There's a way of perceiving the environment that you have to learn and to recognize. But let's come back to that later. We've talked about constraints, and I want to go specifically into, can you explain what the constraints-led approach to motor learning is, and why that's something that people might want to be aware of and might want to start integrating into their coaching?
Yeah. So constraints are all around us, right? And all coaching, I put this out on Twitter and people got all coaching is constraints manipulation, right? That's all you can do. Like, and so an instruction is a constraint, equipment is a constraint, the environment. So but the constraints-led approach for me is deliberately manipulating some constraint to, in particular, trying to get athletes to explore different solutions, right? So usually for me, the way I use it involves taking away something they're already using. So you get a lot of athletes that get kind of stuck in a certain movement pattern, and you want to take it away from them and get them to explore options without telling them, okay, here's how you move, right? So it's kind of a purposeful manipulation of a constraint to try to, one of the examples of, a lot of people use all the time is in soccer or basketball, changing the number of players and space available on field, right? So if you have a team that's, constantly just holding the ball and not passing and moving, by changing the constraints of the number of players and spacing, I'm making that solution less attractive and difficult to use because players are right up in their face now. So they have to try, it's sending you out and getting you to explore something different. So that's kind of how I think of the constraint-led approach.
Yeah. One of the great examples that I liked early on is if you're trying to get a basketball player to have a higher arc on their shot, telling them to arc their shot more is a relatively poor control strategy to achieve the result that you're looking for. You may get a higher arc, but destabilize the other aspects of the performance. But if you put a barrier, then they'll automatically arc their shot without having to manipulate the way they're thinking about shooting to the same degree.
Yes.
And so, I want to go back a little bit, or I want to go in a different direction because I think it helps really understand this, which is the role of variation. So we've talked about the fact that the environment, or the constraints, the conditions in which skill is expressed are always changing, right? And the movement strategies available to us need to be adaptable at all the time. So one of the things that you talk a lot about is this idea that thinking about movement skills as like having to be built up from fundamental building blocks is kind of the wrong way to approach it. There's not an ideal way. There's not one ideal way to take a shot on goal, or to shoot a basketball, or to throw a punch, or to throw a specific type of punch even, right? Because all those things are actually, they're actually have to be adaptable to the specific conditions that they're being expressed in,
right? As
well as the variations in the athlete. So actually, with constraints, they talk about like biological constraints of the athlete, environmental constraints, and then is it social constraints or the other aspect?
The typical one in Newell's model is so individual, environmental, and task. So task is like rules, all equipment, and social constraints are usually, they're probably in the environment you would put it, but social constraints are a big one too, for sure.
Yeah. So I mean, like the whole clinch game in Muay Thai is essentially Well, a lot of it is invalidated once the constraint, that the task rule of not being allowed to use a headbutt enters. There's many things that you do when you're not allowed to headbutt that you can't do once headbutts become available to you. And obviously, there's tons of examples of this in combat sports. Like, you can't really stand like a Muay Thai fighter if someone can take you down. Right. You just, it no longer is an effective response to the constraints. So we have variation on that level. And you kind of reject this idea that there's these fundamentals. We need to have variability. But you also talk about the idea that there are invariants in performance. So if you look at Steph Curry and you compare him to me shooting a basketball, how does the way that variation exists for him different than the way that it exists for me?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think, so by invariance, I mean, there's certain properties that have to be there for it to be. Otherwise, we would never be able to tell skills apart when we looked at them. Like, must be something about a basketball jump shot that we could look at a video, and even we can look at I don't know if you've seen point light displays. You can tell. So his, we tend to people have more kind of the functional variability we talked about before when you were talking about your ankle, and that, so where the body parts are working together. And so it's still things varying. So his shoulder and elbow are working together to get the release point the same, even when he's tired, or there's a fender, he has to lean back a bit more. Versus your unexperienced people tend to have more overall variability and less of that. Sometimes we talk, there's this analysis where you separate bad variability for good bad variability is taking you away from achieving your goal. So, if you jump too high at the start of the jump shot, and then you keep varying do everything the same, your shot's going to go way too long because you have too much force. Whereas a more skilled person would counter that over jumping by under snapping the wrist or something like that. So that's the idea.
Effectively couple or buffer variation in one area with something else. So
we start off with a lot of variability in our movement. No one's denying that. The idea is that traditional approaches, we want to reduce it, all of it. We want to get you to be able to say the same movement over and over through repetition of this, practicing the same jump shot over and over. Whereas the new viewer is that we'd want to restructure the variability. We want to get that functional. We still need a different shot every time, but we wanted the good variability in there.
Yeah.
That's the idea.
So Bernstein talked about the idea of repetition without repetition, right? So you're no two shots are identical. In one way I've seen this described is like there's the effect or the outcome, and then there's the effectors which get you there. And so we want the outcome to be stable, and the effectors are going to be variable. But there's aspects of what you're trying to achieve. There's aspects of the process that are also invariant from trial to trial. Right. For sure. Great shooters always follow through, right? They always, you always see that specific kind of posture with the hand after they complete a jump shot of any kind. Yes. So there's tons of variation. The legs may be kicking a different direction. The hips may have swiveled slightly different based on moving right, moving left, driving forwards, falling backwards, where the defender is, but they pretty much always have that one, the follow through, right?
Yes. Yeah. And you tend to, one of the things you see is, those things become more and more important, and you see the more stringent, the more difficult the movement. Like if I let you move super slow, there's so many, you can move in lots of different ways, but if I make you throw a baseball as hard as you can, these kind of invariants, some of them have to be there. There's no way you can achieve
Yeah.
Yeah.
So within, I'm thinking that the constraints-led approach in some sense is a way of seeking to stabilize the invariance that we need and harvest as much positive variation as possible through the manipulation of task constraints. And generally, I don't know it that well, but it seems to me that the general attitude is that when we can create physical constraints, or task constraints, that the idea is that those have create better organization of the athlete, or better help them find that positive variation and find those invariants than when we attempt to use instructions specifically.
Yeah, overall, I find that in it's to kind of do rule-based constraints or instructions. So the most extreme, obviously, is it's saying, you don't do that. Yeah. Don't bend your elbow. Those don't seem to work at all. Those explicit instructions about body position, movement. There's some great studies where they did motion tracking and showed people can't really implement those. His friend's boss likes to say, your body doesn't care what you have to say, right? Or the coach has to say. But if you create, so what you're trying to do, going back to what we're talking about with constraints, is you're trying to make some new movement pattern functional, right? And the old one not functional anymore. Like you're shooting over the barrier, shooting a low jump shot from your chest. It's not functional anymore. It smashes into the barrier. Getting up and snapping your wrist is suddenly functional, right? So that's the way I like to think about it too. It's making a new, particularly the old one, less functional, and trying to push a person to a new, more functional one is one way to think of it.
So I want to look at a couple specifics, right?
Okay.
So I'm going to just use myself because I'm curious how I can solve these problems. But let's say, so I'm working on changing the way that I do a front flip. Yeah. So we're using a split-legged takeoff in the front flip as opposed to a 2-foot bilateral punch takeoff. So when you do that, one way to achieve rotation is to kick the back leg up. Okay. So this is a very effective way to rotate quickly and get back to your feet. However, the application that I want for the front flip is going over things and going a long way. And so relying on that kind of rotation has this downside, which is that it drives that as the back leg comes up, the chest goes down, which limits the ability to project the body up into the air. So we want to get both those legs to be pushing into the ground and driving the body up into the air. So the first kind of classic way to address that would be to just tell the athlete, don't kick your back leg.
Yeah.
Now, I can tell you in my case that I've told myself that lots of times. It's not very effective.
Yeah.
There's lots of places where that shows up, where we can tell an athlete what the error is, but it has almost no impact on their performance. So a constraint. So the best constraint that I found is just flipping over things. The problem with that constraint, though, is that if the environment isn't sufficiently safe feeling, that fear comes in, and then your behavior just gets squirrely and uncomfortable. It doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
But like I needed a soft enough thing to flip over in an environment where I can land and feel safe on the other side.
Yeah.
That's an example of constraints. I've tried to use analogies, right? So like Nick Winkelman's a friend of mine, and I really love all his work on analogies when we use cues. So I could use the analogy of like take off like I'm taking off for a basketball dunk, because you use a similar sort of, 2-foot takeoff. And that is slightly helpful, but it's not as helpful as a constraint. And then that really leads me to the next idea, which is you also talk about the idea of feeding the error and of differential learning. So how would you think about those and what those offer, and maybe how you might use it in a specific context?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple one. There's one that I thought of that, that might, I don't know if this will work at all, but it reminds me of, so I'm a big fan of, in baseball, I use a connection ball.
Yeah.
So I place a ball. And so I can imagine like yours, you have a ball, something you have to hold between your legs, and you give you the task that you have to make that go forward.
Yeah.
As you rotate. Like if you separate one leg, it's going to fall out and go backwards, right? So you've created a task where keeping your legs together is functional. I don't know if that exactly works.
It's a difficult one. I mean,
yeah.
You might be able to do that constraint. I actually thought about that as I was reading that section. Yeah. And then the problem is that you have to run into a front flip generally.
Okay.
But I was thinking about the idea of connecting an elastic band between the legs.
Mm-hmm.
Something that would give me enough freedom of motion, but that would give me a very strong sense of when that leg was coming up. So it'd feed the kinesthetic sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think but the feeding of air one, is sometimes, exaggerating the thing that you want to get rid of, kind of paradoxically helps people more than trying to give them instruction in the opposite direction of how to do it, because I think what you're trying to do is you're trying to give them information about the solution space. Anyway, exaggerating is kind of giving you more. I was talking about this with someone about basketball, deliberately trying to shoot a free throw so that it bounces off the back rim and goes out. Like that's going to teach you about how to actually sink 3 free throws, right? Because it's teaching you about the relationship between your movement and outcome, which is going to make you be able to adjust to being fatigued, right? It's information, even though it's the wrong thing. If you can deliberately produce it. So that's what we kind of do, and sometimes your case is hard because the challenge is you want the functionality of the endpoint, right? Mm-hmm. Where your body, like, unless you make a reason to be upright at the end, it's really hard, like you say. Yeah. I totally can picture why. Like part of it, I think, is your body's protective mechanism kicking in, right? Yeah. As soon as you start to flip, even though you said don't kick that leg, your body's like, I want to get around, so I don't land on.
This has worked really well for me. For hundreds of thousands of reps, right?
Yeah. So I'm going to get that leg going, and so I think that the key is making. The basketball example, one of the things people have used is like occlusion glasses. So you can't see the hoop until your hand gets up there. So making somehow the solution you want functional, I think is kind of key to it, in keeping that there, or else your body's kind of always going to go around ways. Yeah. So
let's talk about the idea. So if we accept the idea that there's no one ideal pattern, right? And in fact, like if we look at this axis of like how much does the back leg kick up? So let's say we have a binary state. There's a state where both feet basically push off the ground almost at exactly the same time, right? Mm-hmm. So it can kind of be like, right? And then we have one where like,
it's like you have one leg, versus
If that's the case, well, but what you see actually is that some athletes, the best athletes, actually can kind of play between those 2 degrees of freedom, right? So they can utilize a little bit of a leg kick, and they can vary it based on the type of characteristic that they are. Now, my problem is that I've created. So let's break down this terminology. But the way that I'm looking at this is that because of the way that I kind of started developing this skill, and then having changed my perception of what I was trying to achieve with that skill, what I've done is I've created a deep attractor well around the leg kicking up, which is destabilizing the type of performance that I'm actually looking for. And it's not that the leg kicking up is inherently wrong, and that we maybe don't even want to be able to, like, ideally we actually want to have access to all the degrees of freedom between the first action and the second action, right?
Yes.
And then we can be adaptive to the type of circumstance.
Right.
But because I did so many reps like this, my body just keeps defaulting to all the way down that attractor well.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And this is very common. You this behavior emerged out of the original constraints you put on yourself of what you're trying to achieve. And now you have a new set of constraints. And yeah, I think, and getting super terminology that the athletes you're describing is kind of this state of metastability. Sometimes it's talked about where you can keep both solutions kind of active at the same time and vary them so you don't have these wells. But yeah, I think that's a great description of what's going on. This attractor idea. Yeah.
So we have, so we have essentially a kind of infinite set of potential motor solutions to things. And then within that, we're searching for something that stabilizes our performance. There may not be one ideal outcome, right? Or one ideal movement pattern, but there are optimums, right? And the problem is that we can fall into these local optimums that aren't actually the most optimal, right? Yeah. So I'm in a local optimum that works really well for doing Webster front flips when I don't have to go over things.
Yeah.
But I'm having trouble getting out of that attractor, that well of in the motor landscape, and getting into this other one that I can see, that I know is there. And that stabilizes performance across a broader set of problems. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a key point is that we're just so efficient learners. You mean me? Like we optimize relative to the constraints we've placed on us. We don't optimize relative to some external goal, right? That someone states. We don't learn to hit golf shots on all different slopes and lies if you practice on flat ground all the time. Why would we? That's not how that's not from how our brain develops and visual system develops is based on the environment you place it in, right? And not some overall general goal that you might have.
Yeah. So I have 3 kids. I've got a 9-year-old daughter, a 7-year-old son, and a 4-year-old. And obviously I want them all to be movers, but they all have a kind of different level of drive for it. My oldest daughter is very naturally strong and she likes to move, but it's not something she's passionate about. And she gets burned out easily and doesn't want to take lots of classes. My son is, it's very difficult to burn off his physical energy. He just needs to be in sport all the time to develop it. And so it's great. His drives are very similar to mine. I want him to be the expression of my ideal of what an athlete is, as long as it's interesting to him, right? If he decides that really he wants to focus on being a football player, then we'll maybe focus on that, right? But right now it's if he's interested in expressing the whole range of the physical stuff, I'm trying to feed him the best stuff. So he does parkour, he wrestles, and he's been playing football and rugby in the seasons for those things, right? Had him trying dance too. But I used to own a parkour gym, right? And then I left the parkour gym. I started this new program, and that parkour gym no longer exists. And now I've moved to a small town. There's no parkour gym, but there's gymnastics gyms that teach parkour classes. So I go in and I take him to these classes, and it's frustrating for me
I bet.
for a couple of reasons. One is because they have this very top-down, linear model of coaching where they're trying to instruct things. And very often the things that they're trying to instruct are contrary to the constraints that they have in that environment. So a classic problem is that they don't have walls or rails, right? So they're trying to teach vaulting skills that we use over walls or rails. And the kind of default thing is to use a spotting block, which is a relatively wide, relatively soft surface.
Okay. So very different. Yeah.
So it's a very different constraint. So the kids, if you just let them go over it, will naturally a lot of times default to using their knees on top of the surface. So we have to give them a verbal constraint. You can't use your knees. Right? If you do this on a concrete wall, you won't use your knees. Right? Maybe small children will, but you get to a certain body size and it's just no longer an adaptive.
Not going to happen. Yeah.
But the other problem is that it's too wide. The kids, so they want to teach them a skill where they do what's called a step wall. You put one hand down, you put your foot down, and then you swing your leg to the middle. But it's actually too wide for the kids to do that. But they are like, this is a fundamental to parkour. You have to learn it in this environment. This is the tool that we have. So now they're asking the kids to do something that's contrary to being adaptive. And so the constraint is completely against it. And so I'm like, oh man, you gotta like, we gotta manipulate the environment. Like you can teach this movement on balance beams. You can't teach this movement on this. Yeah. The other thing that I see is that they're on spring floors mostly. And so the optimal movement solution very often is to jump up and down and get a strong penetration of the ground, relying on the rebound of the ground to create force. But this is completely not the way that we actually produce force against concrete.
Yeah.
And these can become attractor wells for movement that can become quite hard to let go of. Like one of the things we see is very hard for athletes who've done thousands of forward somersaults straight over their head to learn to do a shoulder roll. Like it's the two skills are close enough to each other that the athlete will fall down that attractor well back to the skill that they're used to. And it's a very hard time getting over and creating a new skill.
Yeah.
So
no, I think that's a great example of, one of the really dangerous things about this fundamental idea is this negative transfer, right? Yes. You're teaching you a solution that's not actually going to work at all in a different environment. There's no inherent problem with letting kids do that if they varied it, right?
Yeah.
Learning to movement solve when you can spring.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine, but you can't learn that's the one way to do it. And yeah.
So I want to talk about differential learning. So I was thinking about this in relationship. We'll give another skill as an example. So I'm trying to learn a skill called a corkscrew. So it's a single leg back flip with a full twist. So you swing one leg and jump off the other leg, flip backwards and twist 360 degrees. So it's a 360 degree rotation in two planes. But generally, in order to do it optimally, you're not actually rotating directly backwards. You're rotating on an angle. So because I started as a gymnast, I again fall into this attractor well of wanting to do everything in a directly sagittal plane, right? I don't want to use this diagonal plane. It's hard for me. So I was thinking about how could I use a differential learning model to disrupt that? So I was thinking about things like, asking myself to flip while like holding one arm up and one arm down, or holding a ball in my hands as I was doing this. So I could start to disrupt some of these tendencies and make my body view the skill from another perspective. So does that make sense to you? And can you just describe why differential learning works and kind of what that is?
Yeah, differential learning. I guess you can think about it on two levels. So differential learning is manipulating the constraints or the variability in the practice conditions. But the way that I contrast it with the constraint set approach is it's not purposeful trying to get here's a constraint that's taking away this and making this functional. It's more kind of random variation, like you're describing, holding a ball, doing differently. With kind of two purposes. One is to get you to learn the solution space, like getting you to learn the relationship between body position and how you move. And I guess the idea is almost like an interpolation. Like if you practice doing this really extreme move, then you understand how to get the between of what you're normally doing and the diagonal position, right? So it's getting people to learn about the movement space. And it's kind of pulling out. There's also this more kind of hardcore explanation of this stochastic resonance idea that you can pull out the signal by varying around it. But to me, it's almost like I like the first one better. You're learning kind of what works, and not on a conscious level, but how to produce these different movements. And I think it also kind of your body develops these attractors because it kind of learns what components need to be there in your movement to generate the one you want. By experiencing some really extreme conditions, I think you're learning the solution space, which helps you get the one you want eventually. That's the idea. So it's more random variation, getting you to deliberately produce these very unorthodox movements that are unlike, right? So another difference, like in the constraint set approach, like the basketball example, we want to try to get you to move like you will in the end, like shooting over that barrier. Whereas differential learning, we're really trying to get you to move in ways that are not totally unlike what we want in the end. We're hoping that you'll get that eventually by doing these weirder movements. Yeah.
Yeah. So I like to use the same skill. So if we're looking at a swing leg backflip, one constraint that I've used. So again, we can kind of think about it. So a coach could say, that's an error to swing your leg directly overhead. So you're swinging your leg directly overhead. So now swing it over the side, right? So that would be, swing it at a 45-degree angle. Now, like the research you pointed out is that something like a 45-degree angle is something that your nervous system has a really hard time. It just doesn't really attune to that. So a constraint that I've used is to have a target that I'm going to kick, right? That's moved to about 45 degrees off of where my head is going to be when I initiate the kick. So that's a constraint. Now, if I was going to, say do a twisting backflip off both feet, and I was going to do that, like grabbing a ball and trying to flip with the ball in my hand, and, or like trying to do it with my hands at my waist or my hands over my head or doing these type of things. That'd be more like a differential learning. So one of the ideas that I like, I was picking up and looking at Franz Bosch strength training and coordination and integrative approach this morning, as well as I was thinking about this conversation. He's talking about the idea of like attuning the athlete to higher order movement control, right? That's another way that we can think about this, that if I can control it in all these different ways, that will help me recognize the control factors that will get me better ability to maintain that control. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things I like in practical, I like combining them actually. Yeah. So in your example, giving the target to hit like a constraint, but at the same time, starting with different stances, starting with different, right? So, so that I found to be really help, because some people I find you give them a constraint and they can't figure it out. They can't figure out how to move to satisfy your new constraint. But by giving them a little exploration of the space, like I do things like different bat weights in my thing. It's not really for any specific purpose other than getting you to vary around kind of this constraint. So, and I find that helps a lot.
So classically with a corkscrew, there's the description of the ideal technique is to do a J step. So you start in one direction, you take one step that takes you maybe 25 degrees back to the other direction. And then the next step has you in a 180 from your original direction of travel. That's called the J step. And that helps open the back leg up so that you get a bigger, longer kick. So I like to do 2 steps into that, right? Some athletes like to do 3 steps. So a couple of differential learning things that we could do is try 3 steps or try 2 steps or even 1 step into it, or intentionally don't make the J all the way, right? Stop it at less than 180 degrees, or from a standing start, do it from a narrower stance or a wider stance, wider gap between the back legs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
And I think that's way, if you asked, Wolfgang Schulhorn, who's that kind of mentor different, I think that's the way he likes to think of it, varying it around the solution you want, the J, instead of just completely random variation, subtle variation. I think that's the way he likes to think about it. Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking about going in also and like trying to intentionally not complete a rotation over the top, but like spin 360 with my foot not going past the height of my hips to try to find those in between phases, right? You talked about this idea that when we're first learning a rhythm, it's very easy to be at 0 phase and 180 phase, right? So if you have 2 things moving, right, they're either moving exactly at the same time or precisely the opposite time.
Yeah.
We're trying to find the space between them. So if I know how to rotate at horizontal, doing a B kick, and vertical, what I'm trying to find is actually that 90.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But my body keeps going to the phase that it's comfortable with.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's getting
so I could try to attune and create this new motor, this new attractor by playing somewhere with both of them possibly.
Yes. Yeah. Getting different constraints or different starting. So putting you kind of a different spot in the landscape, to start with, I think is kind of a way to think about it too.
So I wanted to dig in a little bit more. So we've talked about variation, we've talked about constraints, we've talked about the dynamic or differential learning and what degrees of freedom, variability, all these things. So one of the areas where I get a little bit hung up with the ecological approach is the kind of rejection of information processing at all, or mental representations, right? I've heard people say that like there's these two ways to look at motor control, and it has to be either one or the other.
That's me. Yeah. So yeah.
And I was reading Bosch, and I was like realizing I'm not sure that Bosch is. I think it seems to me that he's a little bit more agnostic about that.
For sure. I've talked to him about it a bunch of times for sure.
Yeah. And my sense is that like in general, models are not perfect descriptions of reality. We know that, right? So we have a model of information processing, and we have a model of this ecological dynamics, and maybe neither is a perfect description of reality. And there's certain ways that I think you've made a really, really strong case that there are aspects of motor control that are not explained well within the information processing. But I've seen times where it almost feels like it reminds me a little bit of behaviorism, where they're like, we just don't think about what's going on in the head.
Yeah.
It's just like, there's no mental representations because we can't study them. And that doesn't like,
sorry, go ahead.
I don't. So I was thinking about, you probably know David Farouk. He's Big Picture Soccer on Twitter. He's talking about the idea that manipulation is he tweeted that manipulation is probably the wrong way to think about, or deception is the wrong way to think about what's happening in sport, right? It's like you're acting, and then you see a new affordance open up, and then you do that, and that's what it looks like when someone jukes somebody out. But that's not my personal experience of playing basketball, or especially martial arts, right? So like I feel like I'm definitely using some kind of mental representation, because let's say that a very specific example. I'm sparring with somebody, and I pump out the jab, and when I hit them with the jab, they try to counter with an overhand right. So this happens 1, 2, 3, 4 times, and each time I see that big overhand right come, I'm able to pull and move behind it, but then I'm not able to. I don't have the time to hit them with a check hook. So my check hook is missing, or I'm just not even pulling it because I can see they're too far away before, by the time I've cleared the overhand right, the affordance of the check hook is no longer there for me. Right. So now I recognize what's happening. Right. So I've thought about it. I have a cognitive representation of what's happening. Or at least that's what it seems like to me. And I think to myself, okay, I'm going to preload this pattern. I'm going to pump out a jab. I'm going to sell it, but I'm not going to try to land it on it. It's a feint. And there's a check hook that is preloaded that's coming off of that. And as soon as I see that overhand right whistling by my face, the check hook is already happening. And so it's this cognitive recognition of what's happening, and this idea of preloading that allows me to predict what's going to happen next. And then I'm able to hit them with the check hook.
Yeah. So, wow, this is how to start. So yeah, I think, so what I'd start with is, kind of an ecological approach. One of the things that we really try to do, and it's really kind of push the field forward, is how far can we get explaining behavior without appealing to these representations, right? So that's where we kind of get the doggedness that frustrates the heck out of people. Yeah. Right. So we would try to, that kind of situation, people would try to, I haven't thought through it all in detail, but there's ideas of keeping multiple affordances available, nested affordances. So people, I'm not sure why predicting what's going to happen in the future is needed in that example. But that's why we do that. And that's why the fundamental idea is that, to me, the reason they're separate things is going back to that indirect versus direct perception. Whether you need to process, prediction is something you do when you don't have all the information, right? I predict the outcome of election beforehand because I don't know how people vote. Mm. The fundamental idea of Gibson is that we have the information. It's that the direct, if I pick up the specifying information from my opponent, I know what they're going to do without predicting it. I guess I can control my actions. And I don't know that. I know that's probably not very satisfying. But
I mean,
the idea, yeah.
I think that happens sometimes, right? Yeah. Like my felt experience as an athlete is, so sometimes that overhand right comes, and I attune to the information as it's happening, and I see the affordance for the check hook, and I'm able to land it. Mm-hmm. But sometimes I have to recognize that a pattern has been playing out and adjust my behavior preemptively, plan the next set of behavior before it happens. And what it seems like to me is that if I can predict that my behavior will result in a specific response from the athlete, then and I pre-plan my response to that behavior will occur faster in that circumstance than if I rely on waiting for the window to open. I have to predict that the window is going to open in order to optimally take advantage of it. Not always, but sometimes.
Yeah. And again, without, all thinking all this through, I think, and the ecological approach would kind of explain that in the nested affordances idea that you're doing one thing to get to another. I think is the idea that people would use for that kind of thing. And also, there's a couple of things, I have a inherent distrust for people's recollections and post hoc recollections of what they do to control their actions, which maybe is not fair. But I do think there's definite phenomenology to this that in the ecological approach, we need to do more, right? Mm-hmm. I think, for example, I think like the situation you described, when you're keeping these multiple options alive and you have a plan. One of the things I think phenomenological people experience is a slowing down of time. It feels like you have more time as an athlete when you do that. So I think there's aspects to that. And I agree. There's just some, I'm kind of determined to try to explain it this way than that way. Because for me, the problem I have with representations is they don't really explain, they just displace the problem for me. They don't really explain how you move. Like you say, I plan the movement. What does that mean? Now, are you initiating a motor program with all the parameters specified for that punch? What goes back to the problem?
I'm setting an intention.
Yeah. So that's, right? Yeah.
So I was thinking about the idea of like attention, intention, and calibration, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm training myself essentially in that situation, right? I've been exposed to the same information multiple times. Mm-hmm. So now I know that if I pay attention to this thing and feed out this information, that's the interesting thing, is the feeding out the information. That's what I feel like is not well represented, but I've set an intention. I will feint the jab. Mm-hmm. I will expect and respond to the overhand right with a check hook. Mm-hmm. I mean, sometimes you can see that you'll see it if you play deep attention to like MMA. Like athletes have patterns that they're choosing to do based off of like those type of reads, and sometimes they're wrong. And they get clocked because the athlete in front of them didn't behave as predicted, right? They've consistently given a specific response to a read, and then they change it when you try to respond to that read. And that's where a lot of knockouts happen.
Yeah.
Right. But there is something about predictive processing happening there, it feels like to me. And I'm not sure that the way that I've seen it described feels intuitively right within the ecological perspective. It seems like there has to be something about prediction. Like David Farouk gave the example of Messi, right? Juking somebody out and going the opposite direction. And in that example, I think it's totally plausible that he didn't have an intention to fake right and go left, or to fake left and go right. But when, Nikola Jokic looks away the defense with his eyes and then throws the ball the opposite way, there's an intentional manipulation. He is predicting the behavior of the other agents in the arena, the other players on the court. And he knows that if he predicts that if he pretends to throw a pass in one direction, that an affordance will arrive in the opposite direction that then he can take advantage of. And he has to kind of, it seems to me that he has to decide that he's throwing the ball that way and looking that way before he does it.
I think, the fundamental, I think part of Gibson's idea also is, we don't perceive to act, we act to perceive, right? So feinting is acting to perceive, right? It's
for sure.
creating an affordance by my movement.
Yeah.
I guess it's what we're talking about. Predicting, I guess, is the sticking point, So having knowledge of what, my actions will realize, I think, is not the kind of same prediction. Maybe I'm thinking like predictive control. Like, so you can have I think you can have an intention to do two movements in a row. Like, I'm going to look, and then my intention is to look right, then pass left.
Yeah.
But you control that online, like type of control. I think I think that's where
but you also see,
and I understand this because kind of another thing we do in the ecological approach is we kind of push everything into intention without really explaining it. And I know we need a lot of work there, I think, for sure. So I understand that. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
that was a good,
Yeah. So I was thinking last night about the way that I teach, right? So I think that I teach in a pretty constraint-led style of approach, but not completely. And it evolved very organically. It's kind of like, I've backfilled in the ecological dynamics understanding to an approach that had already evolved. And I don't know if I described this to you on the podcast, but basically I was teaching gymnastics, which is super linear top down. And then I started doing parkour, and then we took parkour into a gym and started teaching in the gym. And what I was good at based on my gymnastics background was this atomization of skills, breaking skills down into specific pieces that could then be built up. I took my teaching into nature, and all of a sudden my prediction for what was necessary to move a student from being in a certain place in their skill development to the next place was no longer accurate. And a lot of drills and cues that I expected to have to use didn't happen because the athlete self-organized the pattern that I was looking for. And we found that a lot of the movement skills that we're looking for do self-organize, right? Given the right constraints. So looking at one of the examples is a step vault. So a step vault is basically walking or running over the top of an object while using a hand to support you. And you have to be able to thread your leg in between the contralateral hand and foot. Right. So we used to teach this, and you still see a lot of teaching organizations do this. They'll have everyone get down on the ground. So completely remove the context, get into this position and move the leg back and forth. And they think, okay, you have to do this this is a fundamental that you have to teach before you arrive on the obstacle. It's kind of silly. It's actually harder to do the movement on the ground than over an object. Yeah. But if you take somebody for a walk in the woods and they have to step over a branch of a specific height, they will just do this pattern. It's like it's totally automatic, right? It just organizes. However, a lot of times what you'll see is that the athletes will come down on both feet on the other side, and they'll come down rotated about, 90 degrees from the direction of travel. And then they'll have to reset themselves. Mm-hmm. So when I instruct people, I give them a task constraint. Go over this object, go over this object, go over this object, or go over, under, over, something like that. And automatically, most of the basic vaulting patterns that we use in parkour will start to develop if I give them the right constraints. Mm-hmm. However, there are certain things there are certain errors that are consistently made, like the one that I've just talked about, right? Mm-hmm. So sometimes I can use a constraint. So if I give them 2 steps to then take a jump, they'll start figuring it out, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's obvious.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What happens a lot is people set up one vault, right? You go over the vault, and then you're going to go around and go back into line. And this actually feeds the error, because they're just going to rotate to whichever side, and then that takes them back to where they're going, right?
Yeah.
So this is constraint manipulations. But sometimes I'll show them physically, right? I'll say, okay, here, I want you to step all the way down to the ground. So that's technical instruction, step all the way down to the ground. And to me, that is an invariant of high level parkour performance. They always do that in a step vault.
Right.
Another example is the Kong vault. So a Kong vault, I can actually show you a video of this. Are you pressed for time?
I have to about 15 minutes or so.
Okay, cool. So I'll show you this. So share screen. All right. So this is a Kong vault. And I wanted to show you this because it's an interesting illustration of these kind of attractor wells that don't necessarily work well long-term, but that people can get stuck in. So this is Toby Seeger. He's one of the best in the world at this particular skill. So watch the way that his legs set up. He has this is a similar takeoff to the one that I was talking about with the front flip. 2 feet on the ground, staggered. Mm-hmm. He's swinging his arms through. Boom. Legs come through. Okay. So now we're going to watch a novice athlete attempt the same thing. So I'm going to see if I can skip forward a second. Oh, no. And see how he's coming with his 2 feet together.
Mm-hmm.
So I've seen lots of athletes who've gotten stuck at that level, right? Mm-hmm. They don't self-organize to the split foot technique without instruction. So now he's instructing him in it, and I want you to see how it's different, right? Mm-hmm. So here's how he's pushing off with both legs. And now notice that when he does the same thing, he's lifted his leg up and his knee's coming through. Mm-hmm. So the way that I think about this is that you have that your body, when it's standing on one leg and locomoting, naturally swings the leg through instead of pressing down and pushing with both feet. So we have to kind of inform the athlete to do that. So to me, this is a fundamental, or like you can think of it as an invariant of high level parkour performance, though it's not completely invariant. There are environments where, like, if you're taking off of a narrow surface, you have to use this 2 foot takeoff position. But the second pattern, the pattern of driving the knee through, never works. It's never a good pattern, right?
Yeah.
So
that is a good example of something I talked about. Sorry to interrupt. You're optimizing to the specific constraint. So versus the optimizing to some solution the coach has in their head.
Yeah.
Right. There's no, like, the functionality of what the expert is doing is not really being forced on the novice there. Like, they can get what the coach is telling, I want you to land like this. They can do that by the one leg takeoff, right? You know what I mean?
They're making it over. Yeah.
Yeah. They're going back to, they're in a local minimum, right? They're satisfying the specific constraints, whereas you want them to satisfy a global constraint that really hasn't been imposed on them yet.
Yeah.
In this activity, that's the kind of the challenge of it.
Yeah. What happens with that knee coming through thing is that the athletes are much more error prone in clipping their foot or knee on.
Yes.
Thing. So not only do they have lower power, right? So the constraint of going further over something or going higher over something is what's going to necessitate this other technique.
Yeah.
But they might not be able to get to that other technique if they've done this too many times.
for sure.
Easily.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they might clip their knee, clip their foot. So as an instructor, even if they successfully do it in that circumstance, I might want to move them out of that local minimum really quickly because the error rate and the potential for injury is high.
Yes. I think that's a good example. Yeah. Ideally, you would want to make the pattern you want functional by changing the constraints, but that could be dangerous in your situation, right? Yeah. You might have to end up learn that by really injuring yourself. That doesn't work. Yeah. And so, yeah, I totally understand that. So you want to, that's why, I think as a coach, that doesn't preclude explicit instruction as a constraint. Oh, let's put you here. It's usually harder to get it to work. But I think it can be beneficial. Sometimes you're right. That's all you have. You really have to do that. Yeah. Yeah.
So the degree, like how wide the feet are in the takeoff, for instance, or how far the hips dip down, like these are things that I would think of as fluctuators that are going to be dependent on the movement coming in, right? All that context condition variability and the athlete's individual action capabilities and physical structure. But the fact that you're going to split your legs and take off with both legs in a slightly staggered, but not independent approach, that's something that's invariant across all high-level parkour performance. And one thing I was actually talking to my buddy Todd Hargrove, who interviewed you recently. We're talking about fundamentals versus invariance. Like, couldn't you almost see them as the same thing? Like that part of the lesson is that we need to not identify variance as invariance, right?
Yeah.
We need to narrow that down, but still as coaches, we do need to have models for what are optimal performance. And we need to use all the tools at our disposal in some sense to move people there. We have reasons to want to use the constraints as much as possible. Like, let's talk about in a second about reinvestment, but does that make sense to you the way that I'm describing that?
Yeah, I think the key, fundamentals are things we think beforehand that are key to successful performance, whereas invariants are things that emerge because they're functional. I think that would be the difference. I know that might be
really a difference because it's essentially like what I'm saying is that it's emerged within the practice of parkour that it's fundamental to learn to do a Kong vault with a split leg takeoff, right? And I think that in most sports, what a lot of the things that are, maybe not all, because there's this aesthetic and there's this sort of style element that gets stuck. But a lot of what's described as a fundamental is these things that have emerged over time as like all the best performers do this. And when you do this, performance is more stable. And so we want to get the athletes to adopt those solutions basically as early as possible.
Yeah. And I think the difference from, So I definitely, I think a good coach can identify those and make those so it's not the idea. Sometimes the idea of a fundamental is more of a building block, a linear building block, which I don't think is what we mean by the invariance. Like, it's not a linear, so you can't, I don't think you can teach invariance by pulling them out and breaking them apart because they depend on the information and you know what I mean? So, so I definitely, I think I can see the parallel for sure.
Okay. Yeah. I still think there might be, there are examples of like, you can imagine examples of building blocks as well. Right. Like one of the things that I like in the Franz Bosch thing is the idea that variable training is really powerful because it helps you identify movement control, movement strategies that are stable across many different problem spaces.
Yes.
Right. But that indicates that there are those things, right? And that like that you can build off of them, that you want to have this thing. So like, obviously you can't do a muscle up until you can do a pull up. So a pull up is fundamental to a muscle up in some sense.
Yes. Yeah. It's a
tipping action is critical to certain types of movement skills.
Yeah. I guess yes, it has a functionality that kind of builds on. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if you have time to answer this question, but I would just feel really bad if I didn't get to this.
Okay.
Because it's so right up my alley. What is the idea of donor sports? And like, why would parkour be a donor sport to something like soccer?
Yeah, it's kind of, I kind of have a superficial answer, but we're having a deep discussion here. So it's a pretty new idea. I think, it almost, I kind of agree with it and I kind of have some issues with it because it's almost getting into the idea of general perceptual motor abilities. So one idea that we've rejected, in the ecological approach is like, there's these general abilities like eye-hand coordination that you can plug into all these different sports. The idea is no, the skill is specific to the environment. So donor sport has some of that quality to it, like that you learn these general abilities of how to use space. But I guess the difference between what people are thinking about with donor sports is the idea that there's the ability to do things like use space and pick up gaps and to pick up affordances. It helps you when you get in a training environment like soccer, where you also have to use space and gaps and things. So parkour can help, I think there's multiple different things there. I think parkour also, I think I'm a big believer in, although I don't like this term, I keep using it, body awareness. Like so many of the kind of popular sports we play, we don't learn anything about our body position. We don't learn to, get really specific. We don't learn to tune into proprioceptive and kinesthetic senses. Yeah. We were so visually dominant. So when a coach says you're not bending your hips enough, you're bending your knees, and you're like, I don't know what my hips are doing. Yeah. So I think it can benefit in that way. So yeah, the idea that it donates some things, it doesn't transfer like you're suddenly going to show up and be a good soccer player because you play parkour, but it's going to help you maybe get there faster once you start practicing soccer. That's the idea.
So that's my experience, right? And it's kind of the idea behind what EMP is, right? Like evolved move play essentially is like an attempt to create a better general physical preparation system, right? Like what are the fundamental movement capacities that we should all have that will then be a base for anything that you try to do? And how do we create a more adaptive movement problem solver that can then go achieve any, solve any problem? And what I've noticed is, so it's clear that there is such a thing as positive transfer and such a thing as negative transfer, right? So skill can't be 100% specific.
No.
So that indicates to me that there are some level of general abilities, right? So there's an aspect of hand-eye coordination, say, that is specific to anything that you do, right? If you play catch in with a baseball, there's going to be something missing when you move over to Frisbee.
Yes. Right? So there's a capacity that you built up, I think, there that's going to help you learn faster than some. Yeah, for sure.
So you talked about the idea of, you talked about the example of Albert Pujols versus Jenny Finch, right? Yes. Albert Pujols, best, hitter on the planet, got 3 chances to try to get a hit off of Jenny Finch, who's a fast pitch softball player. And he didn't touch it. Right. Yeah. Now, I think that's informative because it tells you that there's not a complete transfer. There's something missing. But I think if you stop there, that doesn't necessarily tell you that there's nothing. Like, I think that baseball is obviously a good donor sport to softball. It's just not a completely perfect transfer. Yes. I think that if you gave him 100 trials, Pujols is going to hit Finch way earlier than I will.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. He has, but how would he hit Finch? By going back and practicing baseball? Right?
No, but
he'd go by practicing softball.
The fact that he practiced baseball would eventually have transfer. It just doesn't have immediate transfer. And this is what I've experienced. So I did parkour for years, and then I went back to, I started doing capoeira, and I went back to jiu-jitsu. Right. So I was doing capoeira, and what I noticed was that if we learned a new movement skill, right? So we're doing meia de luais, which is a kick turning into a sort of front handspring. Like it's a diagonal front handspring out of a kick. My first trial looks no better than anybody else's in class, or very little better. Like just because I'm stronger and more flexible, maybe it's a little bit better, but like I'm confused and uncoordinated like everybody else on trial 1. But by trial 10, I'm consistently better than everybody else in class. And it's because of the awareness of my body, the mental models that I have that I got from parkour. Mm-hmm. Or to give an example from jiu-jitsu, we were working on a sweep that involved spinning horizontally on your back and then rotating up on your back. So it's basically rotation in two different planes. And then you wrap your legs around the other guy and drop him, and you end up in a heel hook position. And what I realized was that almost everybody in class couldn't differentiate rotating their body horizontally from rotating their body vertically. And they had no ability to time that. So they couldn't go, okay, I'm rotating horizontally for this long, and then I'm going into the horizontal. The two movements bled into each other and people just got confused. Mm-hmm. But I was able to not only pick it up much faster, I was able to cognitively recognize what was happening and describe it. And then I could even help the students. I could have, said, hey, we're all going to just work on this rotation, and then we're going to work on this rotation, and then we're going to work on those rotations coming together. Mm-hmm. Right. So they lacked that body awareness and that basic locomotor awareness, which I had. And I attribute that to parkour because I hadn't done jiu-jitsu at that point in 9 years.
Yeah, no, that's why I think parkour is such a good donor sport, is because they don't teach you. You're not learning a specific movement pattern. Like being a football quarterback is not a good donor sport for being a baseball pitcher, right? Yeah. Because you're learning a specific way to throw a projectile that's different than the new way. Whereas parkour is learning how to movement problem solve. It's learning how the movement of my body produces this outcome. So which is, I think, more useful general. Like it is general. You're right.
It's basically it's a generalist movement problem solving activity around locomotion, which is something that occurs in almost every sport. There's always locomotor demands, right?
And I think there's other things like, even with like something like skateboarding, I think there's other higher level things like psychological things, like you're not afraid to fall and hit things and make mistakes, where other sports, we don't get that, build up that error tolerant acceptance that I learned by falling and failing. Yeah. I think in parkour and skateboarding and stuff, we learn that way.
There's a lot of fear modulation as well, right? Mm-hmm. So falling is obviously part of that, but also just in general, exposure to something that's scary and then learning to go through the cognitive process that helps you overcome fear, I feel like has a potentially high transfer between activities, though not a perfect transfer. I think it's something that I rag on a lot, is this idea that like you see all these parkour guys who become super courageous physically, but then are still socially very anxious. So they still can't approach a girl. All right. Like, well, you went over there to become courageous. You better figure out how to transfer it. I still think you can transfer it. Like if you learned how to be courageous over there, you can learn how to be courageous over here, but you have to still engage the process. You have to go through
it's a totally different problem to solve. Yeah.
No, I know I've used up a good half hour more of your time than we scheduled. No problem. I really enjoy this conversation. There's a lot more that I would love to pick your brain about. So maybe we can do another one someday.
For sure. Yeah. Like I said to you, I alluded to, I've been on a bit of a book tour, and this has been one of the deeper into the weeds ones. So I really enjoyed it. So just kind of, it's a very high level concept. So thanks, Rafe.
Yeah. Thank you, Rob. And I look forward to our next chat.
Okay, great.
Have a good day. Oh, before we go, your book, How We Learn to Move. Yeah. Everybody go pick that up. Your website is perceptionaction.com.
It is. Yeah.
And you have the Perception Action podcast, which has got almost 300 episodes on it.
I think it's almost 400. I think 370 something, getting there. Yeah.
I cannot recommend it enough. Honestly, like the reason I was able to have this conversation at this depth is because I've gone and consumed those episodes. They're usually about 20 minutes. They break down the literature. If you want to go read about this stuff and read the literature, it's going to be challenging. But I think you do an incredible job of helping people understand it, and then helping people understand how they could apply it and start getting those lessons through their actual practice. So just cannot recommend it enough. Go check out Rob's podcast.
Great. Yes. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
You too.
Hey, you've reached the end of another Evolve, Move, Play podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, if you want to be involved in the conversation, please consider joining us in our new membership subscription so you can get access to question and answers, with our live speakers once a month, question answers with me once a month, and a dedicated forum to discuss everything going on in the podcast, as well as a general discussion of movement on our general movement forums. If you're interested in that, make sure to check out the link below, get signed up, and join a part of our membership community. If you can't join our membership community right now, it's still always helpful if you can like, share, and subscribe, and even hit that bell and get notifications for upcoming Evolve, Move, Play podcasts. But adios for now, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.